In this video, we are going to engage the world of the text together. We are specifically going to engage Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 7. Our purpose here is to get some practice getting our feet wet with the world of the text. There are several different kinds of things you might engage literarily when you are doing exegesis with respect to the world of the text. We're going to get some of the starting steps out there, some of the things you might do first when engaging the world of the text. So we, in our last video, we left off with this slide here, how to engage the world of the text, where I sort of gave a flyover approach of different ways that we might engage it. And some of these we are going to be going deeper into throughout this semester. And we're going to start with identifying the literary context. You remember there are three rules of exegesis: context, context, and context. That is to say, our own context as interpreters, the context of the text itself, the literary context, and the context of the history and culture of the text. With respect to this second context, the literary context, that is what we are engaging here. And what we do when we engage the literary context, or one of the things that we do, and one of the most important and first steps that we do, is engage what comes first and what comes after, so that we can situate whatever passage we are interpreting within that context, insofar as what comes before and what comes after is going to be inherent to the meaning of what we are actually dealing with. So what I'm going to ask you to do, you can think of this video sort of as an extended lecture pause where I am also engaging in the same activity with you. We're going to do two different kinds of pauses here, engage two different kinds of ways. So for this first pause, I invite you to go ahead and pause. Find Romans 13 verses 1 through 7, preferably in a physical Bible. I think it is really helpful when looking at the context of a text to look in a physical Bible rather than an electronic Bible. And summarize what comes before, really sort of all of chapter 12, and then what comes after in the rest of Romans chapter 13. And I encourage you to write those down. So write down a summary of what comes before, a summary of Romans chapter 12, then focusing in particularly on the last few verses of Romans chapter 12, and then the same thing for the remainder of Romans chapter 13. And then once you have done that, I invite you to sort of state how Romans 13, 1 through 7 fits within that context. See if you can't make connections between Romans 13, 1 through 7 and Romans chapter 12, and then Romans 13, verse 8 and following. So go ahead and pause. Once you come back on, I will give you my own written summaries and my own statement of how Romans 13 fits within this context. All right, now that you have done that task, these are the things that I have said about these different contexts, and I'm going to read out what I have written here. So with respect to the previous context, in Romans chapter 12, Paul begins to instruct his audience about how to be quote unquote living sacrifices. These are his exact words. And he begins to inform his audience what kinds of actions constitute quote unquote spiritual worship. Many of Paul's commands in this section have to do with living rightly in community. Immediately before Romans 13, at the end of Romans chapter 12, Paul writes that persons should not avenge themselves for wrongdoing, but rather they should respond to wrongdoing, respond to evil with good. So that's what comes immediately before our statements of being subject to the governing authorities. Following those statements, and especially the statements about paying taxes, which end Romans 13, 1 through 7, Paul continues that economic language from verse 7, stating that the only debt that one should have is to love. Paul continues in Romans 13, verses 8 through 10, to extol the importance of love before turning to remind the audience that the world has changed and salvation is near. So you can see here that there's sort of connections in Romans 13, 1 through 7 to what happened previously and to what comes after, especially in the summarizing of the following context. There's sort of an immediate link between Romans 13, 7 and Romans 13, 8, insofar as Paul continues to use the same kind of language, the language of economics, of taxes in Romans 13, and then of debts in, Romans 13, 7, taxes in Romans 13, 7, and debt in Romans 13, 8. So the way that I have stated sort of the connections both ways, sort of we have a prong going back into Romans chapter 12 and a prong going into Romans 13:8 and following when we are dealing with Romans 13:1 through 7. So in Romans 13:1 through 7, Romans 13:1 through 7 is sandwiched between Paul's command to overcome evil with good and his statements that acting in love is a way to fulfill debts and commandments. The commands in Romans 13:1 through 7 to be subject to authorities and to pay taxes can be read as ways to overcome institutionalized injustice and act lovingly in an exploitative system. So it's a way in which Romans 13:1 through 7, the commands therein are sort of explanations of how to do the things, how to overcome evil with good from the immediately preceding context, and how to act lovingly and how to have no debt but to love, but to show love as being the only debt. All right, so that's all about sort of the first basic step of identifying the literary context. So this is sort of one of the first steps of engaging the world of the text. Before you do that, identifying the literary form or genre is also of importance, which we have done with respect to Paul. Paul and Romans. Romans is, of course, a letter, something that we have talked about this week. And then one of the other things I want us to do is sort of look at features of a close reading. One way we might do a close reading, or one or two elements of a close reading, is to be able to identify commonly repeated words. And this is where it is very helpful to have your passage printed out and have and mark the passage itself, whether that be in different colors or with a sort of some kind of annotation system. I find that each person should develop their own system of annotation. But so what I want you to do, another lecture pause here, pause with Romans 13:1 through 7. And the best way to do this would actually be to print out this passage and physically mark it. You don't have to do that. You could also look at the screen and sort of note, you might even write down the commonly repeated words. But what I want you to do is look for words that are repeated and mark them, underline them, or highlight them in one color. But try and find 2 to 3 words that you find commonly repeated. And after you do that, a different task here is to identify the different kinds of statements that are made, or the different kinds of sentences that are in Romans 13:1 through 7. And you'll primarily find sort of 3 different kinds of statements here. So be looking for questions, statements, and commandments. So after you come back from your pause, I'll show you my commonly repeated words, and then I'll show you how I have identified these different kinds of sentences. All right, so the first and most commonly repeated word in this passage is the word authority, or in the plural, authorities. Let's see, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times it appears. Seems like it's probably quite important for this passage. And once you start to see a word repeated over and over and over again, that becomes a really good candidate for a close study of that word, doing a word study on the particular word, so you can then know sort of what the different options for what that word might mean in the original Greek, but then also how Paul uses this word elsewhere in other letters and how other New Testament writers use this word. So you have a better sense of what it is Paul is talking about when he talks about authorities. Does he have particular persons in mind? Does he have particular systems in mind? Does he have the highest of the high in mind, the emperor? What is Paul referring to when he refers to authorities? Another sort of contrasting repeated word, this one written 3 times. And it's an interesting contrast because we have sort of authority we think of as a higher figure, but then we have servant we think of sort of as a lower figure. And the authorities, or every time servant is used here, it is about the authorities. So Paul's ultimately saying, these authorities, whoever they might be, based on our word study, are actually servants in some form or fashion. So once again, a good candidate for thinking about this term and how Paul might use it elsewhere. And so you notice how these are both nouns. Authority and servant are both nouns. I want to highlight two contrasting verbs here. So we have be subject. This is a command, an imperative to be subject. And it seems that the opposite of being subject for Paul is resisting. We have a twofold repetition of resisting and this twofold repetition of being subject. So once again, it would behoove us to sort of think closely about what it means to be subject. In this context, Paul gives some sort of explicit commandments of what it means to be subject. But what does it mean elsewhere to be subject? How does Paul use this verb in other places? What other things are persons meant to be subject to? What does it look like to resist something? What does it look like to resist something else that's not authority somewhere else in Paul? Once again, this is a place where sort of doing a word study and seeing how these words appear elsewhere in Paul in the New Testament can be very, very valuable for us. All right, so let's take these away and let's look at the different kinds of statements made here. The primary ones that I first identified are those commandments, those imperatives. With respect to Romans, you'll sometimes hear it said, or you'll read it written, that Paul moves from the indicative to the imperative in Romans. That is to say that he sort of lays out statements, that is the indicative, he is indicating things in the first really 11 verses, or first 11 chapters of Romans, and then he moves to the imperative, to sort of giving commandments of what one ought to do, given all of the stuff that he has indicated, all the information that he has laid out. And particularly in Romans chapters 12 through 15, we get a lot of imperatives, the imperative mood, which is for those of you who are taking Greek know well, it is the mood of commandment. Commandments are in the imperative mood. It is imperative that you do a certain thing. So we have 4 different imperative commandments here. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, do what is good, one must be subject, and pay to all what is due to them. So four different commandments here as one of the kinds of sentences that appear in this passage. But then following each of these commandments, we have sort of an explanation, what I would call sort of a maybe like causal statements, or sort of Paul is giving his commandment and then sort of backing up why you ought to do this. You'll notice the words that are used there. So after the imperative commandment, we have for, for as an explanation. Same thing after then do what is good, for it is God's servant. And then after be subject, because. So Paul is giving the reason that he is giving these particular commands. And the reason that this becomes interesting, the reason it might be sort of exegetically significant, is that pay to all what is due to them. Paul continues that command. I should probably have highlighted the rest of the passage in brown, insofar as it's still, all of that is still a commandment of what particularly to pay, taxes, revenue, respect, and honor. And if Paul's pattern follows, we would expect what comes after 13:1 through 7 then, or what comes after 13:7 to be in pink here, to be sort of an explanation for why you ought to pay. And in fact, that is sort of what Paul does in 13:8. When we look back to our context, we see that he's sort of explaining. We have that link with the economic language that not having, the only debt to have is love. And that's sort of the explanation for why one is to pay taxes, because you don't have any debts except the debt of love. So we sort of, this strengthens our link between Romans 13:8 and Romans 13:7. So once you start to sort of do this closer analysis of particular words, of particular statements, you can then move back, move back to what you have done by situating your particular passage within its context. And you can sort of continue to hone in on how you not only think that the passage fits within that context, but start to move towards making statements about what you think the particular passage might mean. So that now that you've sort of done this stuff, you bring more into the exegetical process. You have more data to work with to sharpen sort of your hypothesis or your thesis about what is going on here. Once again, this is very much why this is a hermeneutical circle or a hermeneutical spiral, because you continue to go around in the act of interpretation, you get more data out there, and it sharpens or focuses your idea and your thinking about the text even more. And so this is only doing it with respect to the world of the text at this point. Once we start to think of those word studies and we start to think of authorities as the world behind the text, or even what are our authorities with respect to the world in front of the text, then we bring that further data in and continue to go in the circle of the hermeneutical spiral, sharpening our interpretation of a particular passage.